Hi and welcome back to a new video, and today that's going to be, I think, a new thing we're doing on my channel. At least I cannot remember that I ever tested a pre-built PC on my channel. But today we're going to check out the Alienware Aurora R12. At least for me, if I remember my youth like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and remember Alienware, back then Alienware was something where you would just go to the website and you would see cases where you would think, that's an extremely awesome design and that's a price I will never be able to afford. That's how I remembered Alienware. And now it's the first time in my life actually that I'm testing an Alienware PC, whatever. So let's just start with going over the configuration. I think that will be the most important thing for the beginning. I didn't have the free choice to pick the parts I wanted to, so they just provided this sample. And we're starting off with the CPU, which is an 11700KF, which I think is a very good CPU for gaming, and it's paired with a 3090. 3090 obviously hard to get, so that's maybe a reason why you would get a pre-built PC nowadays, if it's easier for you to get a graphics card this way. But then you always have to consider the full price of the PC, which we're doing right now. It also comes with 32GB 3466 MHz speed, which I think is quite reasonable, 1TB M.2 drive, which is also great, and Windows is included. You also have to pick your right case and liquid cooler combination, because if you pick a higher grade CPU, like a higher performing CPU, then you also have to pick the higher grade case with liquid cooling. I think if you go for slowest should be 11700F. Then you don't have to take the liquid cooled version. You can go for the air cooled version, which is probably just using an Intel box cooler. But if you pick the K or KF CPUs, then you also have to pick the liquid cooled case, which I think is fine because performance wise should give us some headroom. I already checked it out, so it's not that bad. And it also comes with Windows 10 included, which you have to add up on a price, at least if we're just going to the price comparison website in a second. 1000 watt PSU included. So just from the raw specs, it should be a solid PC, but then it's also 4,000 euro. At least for me, immediately, if I look at a pre-built system, the first thing that comes to my mind is I go to a price comparison website and check out what is the raw component cost. And at least if I go to Geizhals, which is like a German price comparison website, very famous here in Germany, and add up all the components, I picked similar configurations. So a Corsair MP400, 11700KF, some Kingston memory, a Gigabyte 3090, which was available, a Gigabyte C590 Aorus Elite, which I picked due to the fact that the Alienware PC comes with a lot of USB connections, and that's actually a very good thing. But you have to find a C590, C490 board, which also has 10 times USB. So I picked the Aorus Elite, which I think is a fair competitor to this pre-built mainboard. Picked O11 Dynamic, Arctic Liquid Freezer, and a Corsair 1000 watt PSU. Adding that all up, including Windows 10, we have about 3,500 euro. Now that's about 500 euro less than buying the system. But then on the other side, that is a very special case you cannot buy. So if you're, for whatever reason, looking for this very special design, then that's the only way you can get it, right? And I also have to highlight that it's obviously pre-built. So you have to add up, if you just add up the raw component costs, you have to add up the shipping from the individual shops, you have to add up your time. And then there's also the very special service which is included from Dell, which means that, at least for Germany, that's kind of not usual if you just buy a pre-built from a random shop. Because if you have an issue with the system, you can call Dell and they will show up on the day after, and if something is wrong, they can replace components. So that's something that should be highlighted. But again, it's about 500 euro more than building the PC yourself.
Seasonic, the heart of your system.
Let's start off with just looking at this from the outside, judging the visuals. I think it looks quite good, but it still has this touch of a pre-built because everything is made of plastic. It looks quite high quality, especially in the camera. It looks great, but it still has this pre-built feel to it, which I don't really like that much. But apart from that, it looks awesome, like this illuminated part from the Alienware right here, and especially the front looks very nice. You have this subtle lights on the back right here, nice illumination in the front. This is, by the way, also your start button. And looking at connectivity on the front, it's also great. We have 3 times USB Type A, Type C underneath, and audio jacks underneath. So that's fine. Connectivity is great. Visuals are nice, but as I said before, it's still, because of all the plastic, it just feels like a pre-built, right? If we flip the system to the side, we can see some air intakes. This should be probably for the VGA. PSU should be behind this section right here. And on top, if we touch that, we can feel there is some hot air coming out. By the way, this mouse is also included. Just don't ask me why. I mean, just from the feel, I would never use this for gaming. We will start with a Cinebench R20 run to take a look at some figures, especially PL1 and PL2 are correctly configured, like 125 for PL1 and 250 watt for PL2. Looking at the CPU temperature, it's hitting about 80 degrees Celsius, which is absolutely fine, I would say. And now, or at least in several seconds, yeah, we can see a drop to 65 degrees Celsius, which is because it's now dropping to PL1 power target, which is correct, but it happened way too early. If we check out XTU, where we can easily read out PL1, PL2 and tau settings, whatever, we can see PL1 125, which is correct, PL2 250 watt. But if we check out tau, it's set to 28 seconds, which should be 56 seconds. In result, we can get 5100 points, whereas we should actually have something in the region between 5500 and 5700 points. But we can also easily change this in XTU, set this to 56 seconds and apply. And now we can see it's still fine with 86 degrees Celsius. It just dropped down, but that's just right until the end of Cinebench. And in result, 5500 points. So a simple adjustment plus 10% performance. So that's just a very tiny detail which Dell should be able to easily fix via a BIOS update. And talking about BIOS, let's check that out. The BIOS is very clear, very structured. You will find everything that you need, like all the basic options. And also, if we go to advanced and performance options, we will find overclocking options. We can set this to enabled, and there are different pre-configurations. There's OC level 1 and level 2, which are basically different power level settings, and at the same time also core voltage settings, for example. We will later do customization, but let's check out OC level 2 first, where you can see that it's a basic overclocking to 4800 megahertz with adjusted core voltage and enabled XMP2. But yeah, temperature-wise, this is an issue, but let's check that out. Well, I didn't have that issue pre-testing. That's interesting. Yeah, it was just a typical Windows hiccup, whatever. Just running exactly the same again, OC profile 2. And as you can see, the CPU temperature drastically increased. It's now hitting 97 degrees Celsius, and that's also what I found in pre-testing. It will now downclock because the voltage which is set in BIOS is simply too high. It causes too high temperatures, which then cause overheating, so throttling on the CPU, which will result in much less performance. This is actually the second run because the first one was just performed for the German video part, where we saw eventually about 4500 points in the end. I guess this will be even slower. So 3700, almost 3800 points, it's way too low for 11700K. By the way, XMP is applied correctly. However, I mean, it's 3466, but it's CL20, which is quite low for 3466. All right, so quickly back to BIOS. We will do customization on the OC profile, just our manual settings. Core ratio to 49, changed to adaptive voltage with an overvolt of 30 millivolts. That's not much, but should be perfect for us for stable clocks and maintaining proper temperatures. We have to adjust power limits, and that's also quite strange because, as you can see on the text in the bottom, it's set in milliwatt, which is something I've never seen before. It's quite weird. I mean, usually you would set 155 and not 15,500. All right, and 25,100 for PL2. Unfortunately, we still cannot set tau. It's still set to 28 seconds. And to compensate the loss in performance for Cinebench, we are adjusting this to 155 watt. So now with this setting, we will stay at about 90 degrees Celsius, but we will not enter the area where the CPU will start downclocking or throttling. End result, just below 5,500 points. We're still missing about 1 or 2% for Cinebench, which I think is fairly okay considering that's a pre-built. And eventually, if Dell will have a BIOS update, a fix from 28 to 56 seconds, this should finally fix it. But running the benchmarks, I was wondering what kind of VRM temperature we are seeing, but I couldn't read it out with hardware info. But since we're going to disassemble this anyway, we can attach a temperature probe to the board and then check it out afterwards. If we look at this from the back, it absolutely looks like a pre-built from like 5 years ago, I don't know, or 10 years ago. If we pull this right here, prior to that, you have to remove the screw, which will sit here. If you pull on that, you can remove the side panel, which we're going to do. But let's first check out the I/O area of the mainboard, which looks perfect in regard of USBs. I mean, that's awesome. A lot of USB. USB-A, USB Type-C, Ethernet. The only thing I'm missing is Wi-Fi, I would say. And yeah, there's the 3090. The internals are quite interesting. So PSU right here. We have an additional empty slot for an HDD where we have power and the SATA connector already provided. Same goes for an additional GPU, I would assume. I mean, there's additional 8 pins, but I would never recommend to put a second GPU in there. But there is a GPU hold, which is awesome. So this will secure your GPU for transport. That's great. And here we have those locks, undocks things. Okay, so this way the PSU is flipped to the side, which is sitting above the mainboard and the PSU, which I think is quite space efficient. We have the GPU hold down here, which is cool. So GPU is fixed in there, like very firm. That's awesome. We have a 120 AIO sitting in top, which I cannot see right now. And we have dual channel HyperX modules. Now something I somehow missed, it has Wi-Fi. But the Wi-Fi is in an unusual position. So there is this M.2 Wi-Fi card, and the antennas are sitting on top of the case. Here we have the 3090, which is sitting inside the system. I'm not going to review this further because Gamers Nexus did a brilliant video on this card where you can find more details on this. The only thing I would like to highlight for a second is the backplate, which I think is a very good design. It's an active backplate, basically in a term that it will help reduce temperatures because you have thermal pads underneath everything that's relevant, and you also have a heat pipe going through the backplate, which will transfer the heat from those parts towards the rear where you have the air coming through, and this will definitely help in cooling performance. But if you want to check out the card in detail, you should go over to Gamers Nexus and check out the video. Unlike the Gamers Nexus PC, we actually have the liquid cooled version right here, which I think is far better than what he reviewed, because he saw terrible temperatures with the Ryzen CPU. From what we saw so far, I think the temperatures are absolutely acceptable, considering that usually you're not buying such a system for extreme overclocking stuff. So in that regard, the temperatures we saw so far with the 120 AIO were decent, were absolutely acceptable. We also have a 120mm fan in the front, which should be responsible for getting some fresh air for the GPU. We will have to check out the GPU temperatures later. We also have an M.2 drive sitting there, and here we have a chipset cooler for our C490 board, because other than you might expect for like 11th gen stuff, this is not C590, it's C490. But for this type of customer, I think it shouldn't matter much. What I like though is this. This looks like a heatsink which was designed to cool, not to look great, but to cool. So I have faith that the VRM temperatures should be okay. I just unmounted the 120mm AIO, and yeah, contact looks sufficient. Thermal paste mount also looks sufficient. I'm struggling to remove the 120mm AIO, but in the end, I mean, it's just an Ace-Tech based AIO. There's nothing special, so I guess we can just leave it in there and remove the mainboard quickly. Mainboard successfully removed, also removed the VRM cooler. I mean, on the first look, I thought this looks like an okay VRM, but then, yeah, only the left side was occupied with 6 faces. Unfortunately, those pads were not used. I mean, they were prepared for having 2 more faces. But then also, if we check out the Vrm controller, which is an NCP 81266, if I remember correctly, and that's one that's actually only common in notebooks, but it's a 6-phase Vrm controller. The question is, how good will this perform temperature-wise? I'm going to attach the thermocouple to the back, and then we will try to figure it out. I'm almost done with the reassembly, but one thing I want to highlight is how everything is correctly labeled in the PC. So for example, just starting off with like the DIMM slots, and then above here, like underneath the tubing from the AIO, you will have a table how to occupy the DIMM slots, and then everything else is correctly labeled. Like the Wi-Fi antenna goes in here, you have the correct color theme for the SATA cable for this slot. This USB will be blue, this USB will be black. And for example, this is labeled front fan right here. So everything is labeled in a way that if you're not really experienced, you will easily assemble and disassemble this, because it's quite difficult to match it wrong, because you know by the color scheme and everything how to put back which connector on which slot. That's quite nice. So that's the temperature after running Prime 95 for 30 minutes and also running GPU-C render tests in the background in addition to dissipate some more heat within the case. But I think that looks quite alright. Considering that we're still running the PL1 power target at 155 watt, I can totally live with like 84 degrees Celsius under load. That's a fine temperature for running Prime 95. Gaming load should be much lower, and considering that normal power target is 125 watt, I assume it would be more in the region of typically 75 degrees Celsius under load. So VRM temperature wise, it's absolutely okay. It's not the best temperature, but it should be fine for any kind of condition. Now we will also do some gaming comparisons to check the CPU temperature and GPU temperature during gaming. I already checked the base values with times by extreme, and the 3090 was performing a little bit worse than the rest of the 3090 as I tested so far. But you have to keep in mind that I tested them in open bench, and this was tested inside a closed case, and losing 1 or 2 FPS I think could be just due to the fact that it's running inside a case, which will be a higher ambient temperature. I also have to add that this card does not allow any kind of modifications. So if you open Afterburner, you cannot adjust anything, like power target, not even 1%. During gaming, you can definitely hear the PC, which is because of the higher GPU load, I assume. You can see the GPU temperature is 76 degrees Celsius. The CPU is currently always sitting below 80 degrees Celsius, typically like 75, 76. And the GPU fan is just below 2700 RPM, which is high, but not unusually high. But that's also causing the noise, I would assume. And the VRM temperature right now, after 15 minutes, is 68 degrees Celsius. I actually already shot the conclusion once a day ago. And then just on this day, this PC in a different variation was listed on Geizhals, on the German price comparison website, with a different CPU. So exactly the same configuration as this one, just with an 11900KF for 300 euro less. And at that point, things got interesting, because my previous conclusion was completely different. For 4000 euro, I would not get this, because you're paying too much more for something that's not worth it. I mean, you're getting a special case, which just looks special, but like internally it's still just a 40 euro steel case, right? With a ton of plastic around it. And a ton of plastic might look great on camera and also in real, with like the Alienware on the side and the front and everything. Not gonna argue about that. But also it's restricting the airflow quite a lot on the side and on top, which is resulting in higher noise level than what you would usually have if you would have a different case with more fans, for example. Then you would definitely have a lower noise level. In idle, like here, absolutely fine. But in gaming, you will definitely hear this machine. All right, but let's go back to the new listed machine. With the 11900KF listed for 3700 euro. That is a few euro less than just taking the individual components and building the PC yourself. And at that point, I'm not gonna argue about this, because if it's less than the raw component price if you build it yourself, it's absolutely fine to me. I mean, the PC works fine. You have decent temperatures on everything. Even though we increased the power limit for the CPU by 30 watt, the temperatures were still fine on VRM, on CPU, on the GPU. It was due to a higher noise level, but the temperatures themselves were fine. Performance will be fine if Dell fixes the tau. That's something they definitely have to do, because if the tau is set to 28 seconds instead of 56 seconds and somebody buys a PC like this, runs Cinebench once, he will wonder why he has 10% less performance than what he should have. And that's something they should fix. Temperature-wise, it's no issue to run tau for 28 seconds more. I tested that, we saw it in the video, so it's absolutely no issue to get the extra performance. In gaming, you will not lose this performance because the tau is not really relevant for 99% of the games. That's why this should be fine, but they should fix it, because there is no way why you would go for 28 seconds. Okay, so regarding the 11900KF version with 3700 euro, you can go for it. If you want to have a pre-built system with decent service and you're never going to touch a system, you know for sure that, or you're buying it for somebody where you know he's not gonna do anything about PCs, then this should be a fine system. Otherwise, I would always recommend to build your PC yourself. You know that. Even if you're in a situation where you never build a PC, you will learn from it, you will gain experience from it, you should try it. But if it's for somebody who's never going to touch a PC, who just doesn't want to do it, then the 11900KF for 3700 euro, at least in Germany, would be a good consideration for the price. This version with the 11700KF from Dell I would not get because it's simply too expensive for what you're getting. The case is not special enough. It's just special visually, but it's not special when it comes to performance. Should sum it up. All right, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye-bye.